So, dear colleagues, 9:01, we should start. We will switch to point 12 of our agenda. That's the presentation of the study on the future trade relation between EU and the UK after Brexit. I'm glad to have Professor Eeckhout here with us. He is author of the study, and he will give us an introduction in the study for 10 minutes. Please.
Thank you very much, Chairman. It's a great privilege to be able to present a study prepared for Parliament, and grateful for the opportunity both to be able to write the study and publish it for the Parliament and to introduce it a little bit today. I will try to keep my introduction limited and not discuss all of the points which the study makes, but perhaps to focus particularly on some of the basic goals which I had when writing this study in the context of the ongoing Brexit negotiations, which are, of course, a bit of a moving target, or I thought a bit further about that image of a moving target. It's maybe not a moving target, it's perhaps the marksmen who are moving all the time, particularly on the UK side. So it's quite noticeable how a study which I completed in February seems already, in some respects, outdated in light of the current debates about the future trade relationship. One of the things I was really keen to do was to put what one could call the models contest a little bit in perspective. Many commentators have looked at the issue of future trade relationship from a perspective of deciding which model the United Kingdom would embrace in terms of its future relationship, and the models are associated with particular countries with which the European Union has a trade relationship, the Norway model, the Turkey model, the Swiss model, and so on. And I think there's a deeper layer if you look at those models, and that is really the difference between what I've called the market integration paradigm, which is essentially the relationship with the EEA countries and with Switzerland, and to some degree with Ukraine. And on the other hand, what I call the trade liberalisation paradigm. And I think these really have developed into two different paradigms, which have quite deeply different characteristics, which are relevant to the debate, I think. And what I've tried to focus on mostly in light of my own expertise is particularly some of the legal and institutional differences between market integration and trade liberalisation. And I think if we look at the last 20 years of history of how the EU has developed and how international trade policy has developed and international trade relations, if anything, that gap has grown between how integrated the EU internal market is and the limits to trade liberalisation. My study also does not comment on any economic effects, but I think, if anything, economic modelers are not able, I think, to take into account really the differences between those two models, and I would worry a lot about the sort of level of uncertainty for investment which would be created if the UK ultimately were to abandon the market integration model. I've also tried not to focus too much on tariffs. It seems to me that a lot of the Brexit debate is excessively focused on tariffs, particularly around the concept of a customs union. I mean, tariffs are, of course, significant up to a point, depending on sectors and the level of the tariffs, and they, of course, give rise to the need for physical infrastructure and checks at borders to apply tariffs, but they're really only a small part of the picture. And what's really relevant to economic integration is, I think, the mere divergence, what we call non-tariff barriers, the mere divergence in product and market regulations, and at that level also Brexit is still rather uncertain. I also wanted to highlight in the study the significance of and the connections with so-called flanking policies, and that's not only competition policy but also, for example, environmental policies or even consumer protection, where again the two models of market integration and trade liberalization are very different. And I also wanted to try to unpack some of the basic concepts, such as mutual recognition. I'll return to that in a minute, alignment and harmonization. So these were some of my goals. And so what I tried to put across, at least is my understanding of the differences between the models and the differences between the two paradigms, is mind the gap, or perhaps mind the gaps between market integration and trade liberalization. If I can speak to a couple of the points which are relevant there, mutual recognition, the United Kingdom seems to be keen to have a deep and at least a deep and comprehensive free trade agreement. This morning it looks like it might be even accepting a customs union for some further years. And that within the context of this deep and comprehensive free trade agreement, and given that the United Kingdom's regulations are of course at present fully compliant with EU law, the idea seems to be that it should be possible to set up a system of mutual recognition. I personally think that is quite hard to do, particularly in light of the red lines which the UK government is imposing, because if you try to unpack mutual recognition as it works in the EU internal market, and I'm not speaking about mutual recognition in terms of conformity assessment, which is really only a small segment of mutual recognition, but actual recognition of all sorts of product and market regulations. The way in which this works in the European Union is through harmonization of legislation. So it's not really the case law, it's mainly EU directives in the internal market which achieve a minimum level of harmonization allowing for mutual recognition. So with that, of course, comes full participation in the EU legal system with all that entails. And there's a bit of a debate also in academia. There's a blog post by Professor Nikolaidis from the University of Oxford talking about the opportunities for continuing to have managed mutual recognition in the EU-UK relationship. There's also a blog by Professor Wetherill from the same university. One is a political scientist, the other a lawyer. I'm afraid I'm on the lawyer side. I think it's, if the United Kingdom really wants to leave the European Union, leave the jurisdiction of the EU Court of Justice, no longer make EU law part of domestic law, it becomes a lot more difficult to achieve something like mutual recognition, I think. Just a few words on services, if I may throw out, again, quite a personal opinion, but if you dare compare internal market integration and trade liberalization in the area of services, you can see effectively, I think, that the idea to achieve international trade liberalization through a kind of conceptually unified system, which was created when the WTO was created through the GATT, General Agreement on Trade and Services, which tries to conceive of international trade and services in similar ways to trade in goods, with trying to tackle barriers to trade through rules of market access and non-discrimination. I personally think that project has failed. It has failed in the WTO, and even in the most advanced free trade agreements which the European Union has concluded, there is really very little in terms of real liberalization of trade and services. I think trade and services has become internationally more, has opened up, but that's not been a result primarily of the sort of trade liberalization through the WTO or trade agreements. It's been more at the sectoral level or simply through changes in domestic regulation and unilateral opening up of markets. So there again, a free trade agreement, I'm not sure what it could offer in terms of trade and services. Free movement of persons, a few quick points. just to say that I think free movement of persons cannot be looked at purely as a non-economic policy, cannot be looked at purely from a migratory perspective. If it genuinely contributes to the market integration we know within the European Union, and does so in a number of ways, not least politically also, of course, to allow the opening up of markets to be, if you like, compensated by opportunities for people to move and work throughout the European Union. And as a lawyer, the next two ones are really very important in my view. The international trade liberalisation works through agreements which are fully embedded in international law, international agreements which increasingly are not recognised as having direct effect. This institution, I know, has often advocated that international trade agreements should not have direct effect in the EU legal order. That's a policy I would not necessarily always agree with, but it is a policy which not only the EU embraces, but others around the world as well. And the contrast with the direct effect of EU law and the fact that EU law, EU internal market law, is fully part of domestic law is really quite enormous. And I'm applying for my own trade, of course, but I would think that this is the invisible hand of trade and economic integration, which we tend to forget about. The fact that the integration is real by being part of domestic law embedded and giving opportunities to any company or trader to enforce rules in court very effectively as a result of the direct effect of EU law. And of course, with that comes the jurisdiction of the EU Court of Justice, which can be accessed by, in any case, through national courts. And if you contrast that with what's happening internationally, the WTO appellate body is currently very much under siege by the Americans, who refuse to appoint new members, as you know, to the appellate body. And the systems which have been set up under free trade agreements by the EU, for example, are not really working very effectively. I've seen no actual decided cases under any of the free trade agreements. So here too there are huge differences. I'll skip flanking policies in the interest of time. Maybe a word on institutions and agencies in particular. There again, the market integration paradigm, the kind of market integration we have within the European Union is moving further away from international trade liberalisation through the creation of agencies which are acquiring significant regulatory powers. We are moving within the European Union more towards a system of what one could call executive federalism, where actually at the federal level there's a strong executive role, and that's it's difficult to see how a non-member country could be part of that system without accepting being part of the EU legal order. Finally, what's not in the report, I didn't speak in the report about the customs partnership, which has been in the news for the last couple of weeks, because in February it didn't look like that idea would go anywhere, and then it became sort of central, it seems, to debates within the UK government, even though this morning it looks like it's being abandoned again. I would just want to say one word about the customs partnership, which I think has not really been picked up very much by commentators. The use of the term customs partnership almost suggests something like a customs union. But if you look at the partnership and how it is conceived of, it is essentially, it would be a free trade agreement, because the United Kingdom would keep its, or would want to have the power to have an independent trade policy and to be able to conclude trade agreements with other countries around the world. So the idea of collecting tariffs for the European Union, whether it can work technically, I'm not sure. But even if it were to work, I think the EU would still insist on rules of origin, which would need to apply to trade between the UK and the European Union. For else, the UK could conclude, for example, a trade agreement allowing imports of car parts without tariffs, which would benefit investment in the car industry within the United Kingdom, and then if the UK cars can then freely access the European market, that would create a competitive advantage. So it is actually an FTA, and so I don't really see what the customs partnership adds. And there's also some a bit of analysis of what will happen or what could happen to the trade agreements which the EU has concluded, but I will leave that perhaps for debate, and I apologize for exceeding my time. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Professor Eeckhout. So now we have 25 minutes for question and answers. And I open now the request floor. And who is the first? Mr. David Campbell-Bannerman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yes, I just wanted to compliment Professor for, I think, a very fair and informative report, first of all. The point I was going to make about this report is it seems to me where we are hasn't changed in the sense that the real preferred options from the British point of view seem to be a free trade agreement, which I would call Super Canada, or CETA++ is what's really being offered at the moment. And in evidence of the CETA++ being offered, President Tusk said on the 7th of March this year, I propose we aim for a trade agreement covering all sectors and with zero tariffs on goods, which is the first plus I would suggest New Zealand and Canada aren't getting 100% tariff-free access. And like all other FTAs, it should address services, which is the second plus I would suggest. So we seem to be offered CETA++, which is great, and that's a very good basis to go forward on. And Mr. Barnier said on the 13th of March in our Brexit debate, we have chosen, the UK has chosen to leave the EU, the single market and customs union, and we have taken that on board. So I think that generally is the position. I don't think, therefore, EEA or customs union is really a player, and that remains the case even with the fun and games in Westminster, which I'm sure you've been following, the 15 amendments on this, which should be reversed in the Commons. And I would say if they are not reversed in the Commons, there is a lot of a head of steam building up in Britain to go straight for World Trade Organization and get on with it. The British people are getting fed up with the delays. And there is, I think, the chance of going to World Trade Organization and no deal is actually gone up quite considerably as a result of these amendments and a lot of the messing around going on, which I think is disrespectful to the British people. The question I would ask the Professor, if I may, is it's very interesting you say in your report about the World Trade Organization option, in your words, the transition can be relatively smooth. That's on page 24. I was wondering if you could say what would happen if we had to go to World Trade Organization. What happens on the customs side? How fast can you do a customs deal? Or would you have to actually sort of carry on, do a special deal just to sort of carry on with present customs arrangements until you actually do a proper customs agreement in the event of WTO? I think that's the main thrust I've got on the report. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Alessia Mosca.
Sì, grazie. Anche io volevo complimentarmi perché...
Yes, I also wanted to express my compliments because I think that this is one of the most interesting pieces of work that's been produced on this subject. And I really would like a round of applause, if you will, for the type of support that's been given here. A couple of considerations on the proposals being made. I seem to have picked up in the study here that any solution proposed will not actually solve the problems we're discussing here, the relations with Northern Ireland. So the study does not identify any real creative way forward, and none of the options succeeds in identifying such a way forward. So I'd like to ask how you think we can move along this rather difficult path. Second thing, I'd like to ask for further clarification on concerns jurisdiction, because it's true that there are different levels of acceptance of the different jurisdictions that there are, but it seems to me, I have understood, that any of the options foreseen represents either technically or politically a possible problem. At the end of all this, one last point, time concerns will stop us from going on longer, but the study brings out also the problem of what the future of trade agreements might be. And the study identifies this as a marginal problem. But in the light of that presentation, I am asking myself if that might really be a marginal problem, or rather whether our partners, as we're already beginning to see, might give rise to problems at the time when the UK leaves. Thank you.
Gracias. Helmut Scholz.
Thank you. I want to thank Mr. Eeckhout for the presentation. Three short questions. We had just in the Brexit monitoring group also an exchange of view concerning the customs union, and regarding that there is no clearness at all politically where we are going, in which direction. There was more or less a big mist about what will be the future customs relationship between the United Kingdom and the European Union 27 after Brexit has happened, including the open question of the transition period. And having looked into your study, I think you also are a little bit avoiding to prescribe in which direction we have to move. But that means that if we are looking, for example, into the internal structure of producing units of British enterprises in the European Union, we are facing an increase of the cost of production. And that will have a direct effect on the products themselves, which maybe are British, or in the infrastructure of the enterprises, then maybe also European issues. So how do you see it? What does it mean for the future of the commercial and the productive perspective of British enterprises in the European Union, and what does it mean for the job places being affected by these challenges? Second question I would have is, you mentioned today the problem on the services, and you are coming from the angle of liberalization of the services. I guess that the TISA negotiations are also in a certain difficult shape, because services could not only be charged by the economic effects of liberalizing the services, but that we have always to take into account the consideration of the affected workers and servants in these services industries, which will be directly affected by the way of how we are organizing the future of trade and services. So how do you see this challenge concerning the open question until now, even with a divorce agreement which has still to be found, concerning the rights of the citizens? That will be not regulated. And here I would ask if you can describe a little bit more your perspectives on that issue. Thank you.
Jude Kirton-Darling.
Thanks very much. And thank you very much to Professor for the study, which is really interesting. And I was particularly struck by the conclusion that you came to at the end of your conclusions, and I'll just read it because I think it's a really important statement. It's particularly deplorable that the Brexit phenomenon has been characterised by such a strong rejection of the role of common law in matters of trade and economic cooperation and integration in Europe. The UK rejection of the role of the ECJ and the desire to take back control mean a return to intergovernmentalism and a model of international relations characterised by power politics rather than democratic deliberation resulted in shared law. And for me, as a convinced European, part of the benefit of the European Union is that we work together through the democratic deliberation in the European institutions to find common solutions to common problems and to work to use our economic strength as the largest trading bloc to try and get the best for our citizens and a fairer trade policy around the world. So I think that's a really strong and important conclusion to draw out. All of the analyses about the economic impact of Brexit show that any model of us leaving the EU will have a detrimental economic impact. And the economic impacts in certain regions are far stronger. And my home region of the northeast of England is the region which will be the hardest hit by any exit from the European Union, because we have a trade surplus with the European Union, unlike in trade surplus in goods as well, unlike the whole of the UK. The UK has a trade surplus in services, and that's why I think the comment that was made by you, Professor, that the whole debate in the UK has very much been dominated so far by customs is slightly perverse, because yes, our manufacturing base is very important. It's a crucial part of my regional economy. But our manufacturing base is still a small part of the UK economy overall. And if you look at what is on the table in terms of an FTA, it cannot meet the demands and the concerns of our service industries in the UK. I'm absolutely convinced that we have to look in more detail at the proposal which you've put on page 18, which is the idea of a bespoke EEA model, which would be EEA plus a comprehensive customs union. And then I guess the question that we get raised then in London, which it would be interesting to have your view on, is, and you reference it, how much you think the UK joining the EEA would mean that there would be a possibility for more participation from EEA countries in decision-making. If there's a flexibility, if the kind of Bruegel Institute's view of different circles of integration with the core of the EU and others outside is a possibility, and if the UK joining the EEA could actually change some of the decision-making there, because it's absolutely crucial for us and crucial for regions like my own. Thank you.
Last but not least, Inma Rodriguez-Preo.
Muchísimas gracias, presidente.
Many thanks, Chair. And many thanks for the study and for the presentation of that, which we've just heard. I'd like, if it's possible, to go into a bit more depth on everything that refers to regulatory divergence, because we've had all of our trade agreements which normally want to get rid of trade and non-trade barriers, but also to have regulatory cooperation. But here we're in the exact opposite case. We're starting from a situation of integration, and we're going to go toward less regulatory convergence. Now, how is this process of divergence going to be managed? And how are we going to see that this divergency, which is certainly going to happen, has the least possible negative effect on trade? And then on the second issue that I'd like to present, independently of customs checks, at the point in time when, unfortunately, I have to say, the UK leaves the European Union, we will have to establish all the customs check and control mechanisms that will be necessary. How will we be able also to guarantee that we will have homogenization of the best possible conditions so that we don't have additional barriers, especially for trade for SMEs? Thank you.
Mr. Dartmouth and Mr. David Campbell-Benwell. Very short and precise. Mr. Dartmouth.
Shall I let Mr. Campbell-Bannerman go first, and could I go afterwards? But that would be irregular.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's really just a point of information. Judith Curtin-Darling drew attention to the last paragraph, and I felt the language there seemed to be very different to the rest of the report. Did you write that paragraph alone, or were you actually, did you receive any influence from any other quarters on that last paragraph? If you would like to make that clear, I'll be most grateful. Thank you.
Now, Mr. Dartmouth.
Thank you very much. There's just a few basic facts to get across, which don't seem to go into the dialogue at all. I don't mean just this dialogue. I mean all the dialogues that have taken place, including the referendum. Very simple point. If you want to export goods to another country, you have to obey the regulations in that country. If you want to export cars to the United States, as Germany does in huge volumes and value, German car manufacturers have to obey US regulations. That's why sometimes you see for various bits of kit, it says this is not available to be sold in the United States. Anybody exporting anywhere has to obey the rules. The issue is, should the EU's rules apply to all those exports from the UK, from all those sectors and segments of industry, manufacturing, services and so on, which do not export to the EU? Now, broadly speaking, about 12% of the UK economy is accounted for by exports of goods to the EU, which means, and that, incidentally, that proportion is declining. It means that 80% is not. Now, the problem with EU membership, the problem with membership of the single market, the problem with the European Court of Justice, Julia Curtin-Darling, is that if you're in the single market and if you're in the EU, it means that the 88% plus, which will be 90% in about 18 months' time, of the British economy, which has got nothing to do with the EU, is nonetheless falls under the burden, and it is a burden, of all the EU's laws, rules, regulations and directives. Now, that is something. Now, you may say it's worth it. You may take the view that I do, which is it's not worth it. But at least that should be in the discussion. Instead of this, frankly, this is just completely ignored. European Court of Justice, what the European Court of Justice does, amongst other things, is it enforces the rules of the single market. If you're in the single market, you fall under the thrall and the suzerainty of the European Court of Justice. Maybe that's a good thing. I didn't realize it was so rationed, actually, because it really is rather important. We've been sitting here all this time. And I'll just make one final point. I really am very quick. I'll pray in the indulgence of the chairman. We sit here in the International Trade Committee of the European Parliament with our distinguished colleagues and our even more distinguished chairman, discussing a lot of time about trade agreements. But the fact is, you don't need a trade agreement in order to be able to trade successfully and to trade profitably. And the fact of the matter is, the three biggest exporters to the European Union, namely the United States, China and Russia, don't have trade agreements with the European Union, nor do 5 of the top 10 traders, nor do 11 of the top 20. You don't need a trade agreement in order to be able to trade. And I think this whole report is looking at it from the wrong end of the telescope. It should really be from the other way up. It should answer the question, that is, what would it be like if there was no trade agreement and we trade under World Trade Organization rules? That is the discussion which we ought to be having.
Thanks a lot, Professor.
Thank you very much. Let me start with something which came up towards the end of the questioning. I can say that I wrote all of this report single-handedly, including the last paragraph of the conclusions, and I reflected considerably about how to put those paragraphs, and I stand by every word I put there. I think also the Honourable Member of Parliament referred to the fact that I would have said that a transition to the WTO would be straightforward or something along those lines. I'm not sure where that would be in the report. Anyway, the question was about what effect that would have on customs. Well, obviously, a transition to a WTO relationship between the European Union and the United Kingdom simply means that the European Union must apply its full external tariff to imports from the United Kingdom. If it does not do so, it falls foul of the MFN principle in the WTO. So in the absence of a free trade agreement or a customs union agreement, the full tariff schedule needs to be applied in the exact identical way that it is applied to, for example, imports from China or the United States, to mention those two with which there is no trade agreement. And that, of course, the level of the tariffs depends on what the tariffs are for particular sectors, but they would apply to any trade between the UK and the European Union, and I think that would obviously require border checks, not only between Northern Ireland and the Republic, but also for all other trade. There was a question on Northern Ireland, and that my study does not suggest a creative way forward, which I fully accept. I fear that I find it very difficult in the present political conditions with the red lines which have been drawn by the UK government and if you like, the red lines, although they are less expressed as red lines drawn by the European Union, very difficult to see what the creative way forward would be. Clearly, the absence of a border in Northern Ireland is not just a function of the customs union. It's also a function of both the UK and Ireland being in the internal market. So there is actually no need for any border controls, and we know from our own history how many years it has taken the European Union to actually get to a stage where it is possible to have trade between member states without having physical borders and border controls. It's the whole internal market programme, which took 10 years and 300 pieces of legislation. So I cannot see how you could avoid having a border without indeed, as the joint report sets out, having full alignment between in terms not just of customs union, but also internal market regulations between Northern Ireland and the Republic. So either Northern Ireland is subject to some kind of special status, or one has to extend that to the whole of the United Kingdom and keep the United Kingdom in some way in the internal market and in the customs union. And anything else will create a need for certain checks, and there is, of course, a very important issue of the physical border, and there are probably ways to try to mitigate the need for a physical border, but I think probably in the Irish context, and I'm not an expert in this field, the extent in which the economy is integrated there between Northern Ireland and the Republic goes beyond the physical border and border controls, and I cannot see a Brexit outcome which would not do damage to this unless the United Kingdom stayed in the customs union and the internal market. There's a question also around the problems in relation to jurisdiction. I assume this refers to dispute settlement, and much there depends, of course, on how the future relationship is shaped. But I think as soon as you start looking at cooperation and even more than cooperation, a sort of sharing of regulatory approaches between the United Kingdom and the European Union, you need something more than the traditional dispute settlement which we have in international trade. You need more than a panel which can be accessed by the parties. You need a system really where you ensure that the law is applied broadly, uniformly. And we have that in the EEA through the EFTA court, and you would probably need something like that in a UK-EU context as well. On the question of future trade agreements, which I did not intend to deal with as a marginal problem, I think if you ask for my views on this, and it sort of relates also to other comments made by members here, the aspiration for the United Kingdom to develop its own external trade policy would probably in practice have to start with simply trying to catch up with what's already there, with trying to ensure that the advantages of the existing free trade agreements which the EU has with third countries are maintained and are not diminished. And that, I think, would not necessarily be an easy exercise because, quite simply, the United Kingdom cannot offer the same sort of size of market as the European Union is able to do. If I were advising a third country, which I'm not, to clarify that, I would advise them to try to get something more from the United Kingdom than they were able to get from the European Union. And it's clear that these trade agreements cannot be simply continued, that third countries have every right to say, well, actually, we are no longer bound by these agreements.
Evidence. Where's your evidence? Evidence.
In what sort of evidence would you be? I think the evidence, there's already been quite a number of statements by third countries that they would want to sort of look at a number of aspects of the existing agreements. But I say that's an assessment of something which has not materialized yet, and it's difficult to find evidence for that. So I don't think it is a marginal problem, and I think frankly, the idea that the United Kingdom has a lot to gain from developing its own trade policy is one on which I am sceptical, particularly because you need to be able to offer something in international trade, and size simply is important in that respect. Customs union and the possible effects on businesses, I am really quite worried about this. And I'm worried about this in the sense that I think no economic modeler at present is able, economists have tried to the best of their ability to try to model the possible effects of different scenarios, Brexit scenarios. But I think it is very difficult for anyone to really gauge the extent to which a fundamental change in the terms of trade, which leaving the customs union would mean. I mean, for supply chains which have been built, investments have been built on the idea that you could hire any people from across Europe, that your parts could go up and down anywhere between member states of the European Union continuously without any checks, just-in-time delivery. What leaving that system would mean to investment decisions by businesses is, I think, very difficult to gauge. And the WTO has as one of its core aims of, among other things, its dispute settlement. It's there in the agreement, the security and predictability of the trading system. And that's a very significant consideration, I think, in economies today. And that security and predictability would be threatened by a change which is difficult to foresee at present. So I would be worried about that. On services, I think indeed that the idea of the 1990s that we could look at international trade in services through a purely economic paradigm of trade liberalization has failed. And the reason is that the barriers to trade in services are not purely protectionist barriers like customs or other protectionist measures at the border. We have no border measures with services. We have some real market access restrictions, but mostly the reason why services trade may be more difficult is the fact that different jurisdictions regulate services in different ways. So you need to look at this from a sectoral perspective, I think, because financial services and transport services and telecoms and legal services and education and health services are just not comparable in terms of the ways in which they are regulated, and for very good reasons. So the only way forward, I think, worldwide is to look deeper into sort of shared values and try to ensure that domestic regulations reflect those shared values if we really want to further liberalise. And we see within the European Union how difficult it is to actually achieve full free trade in services with all the deeper integration we have. And rights of citizens very much so. I mean, I think the United Kingdom is already seeing that in conversations with, for example, India about a free trade agreement, how the Indian government would insist on having better access to the UK market for its citizens and service providers, and that's, of course, closely connected to immigration issues. The question about European Economic Area and a customs union and participation in decision-making. I have not put that very starkly in the report, but I do think even the EEA is problematic as it's developed, and at the time at which it was created, I think it was a good answer to some of the questions we were facing. There is a genuine problem of democracy, of course, with the EEA, and I do wonder whether we could think more creatively about sort of second-tier membership or closer association, which does allow the associated countries to have more of a say in those regulations which they actually adopt. But that there would be scope, I think, for cooperation between a number of third countries to try to achieve that. Regulatory divergence, how to manage that it has the least negative effects. Well, I think it's difficult. On the other hand, from the perspective of the European Union, should I? Yeah, I'll try to be really short. But I did want to say one thing. It's less worrisome for the European Union that there is regulatory divergence, because I fear I don't agree with the honourable gentleman that the fact that most of UK production is for the UK market means that there shouldn't be a need for the UK to adopt all of the EU regulations. But the European Union is a very big market, and we see increasingly that it actually doesn't need to convince third countries to comply with its regulations, but that businesses do so anyway because they just want to have access to the European market. So I assume that would happen in the United Kingdom as well. I'll leave it there, I think. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot. I'm totally convinced that we will raise this point once again, or twice, or 3 times. Nobody knows. Thanks a lot for your fruitful presentation and work. We switch to the next item, item 13, and we have only 10 minutes. Daniel. On which paragraph?
I have a point of order.
On which paragraph of the rules of procedure?
What, sorry?
No, make it quick.
I'll be very, very quick. Could I request another time that colleagues have more time to speak on this? I mean, we had very good contributions from Julia Curtin-Darling and David Martin. It would be nice, and David Campbell. It would be nice to have heard them for longer. I would also say that the speaker, in his summing up, brought in a whole lot of new subjects which weren't even in his report at all and didn't come up in the conversation. And this we haven't heard before. So maybe this is a new precedent that the speaker can just bring in new comments.
So we are always in with limitation of time, and everybody is trying to speak as long as he or she can. That's always a problem, and I think it's totally clear that we will have another discussion about trade and Brexit, and I think several times. Daniel.